Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Austin. I'm the founder and CEO of Children First Canada, and it's my honor to welcome you here today. As we begin our time together, I want to acknowledge the land that we are all gathered on. Today's event brings Canadians that are young and young at heart together from coast to coast to coast. And in the spirit of reconciliation, Children First Canada acknowledges that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples across Turtle Island. Today, I'm in Calgary, Alberta, which is the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Métis Nation Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. I also invite you to take a moment to honor the land that you were on today. As part of our commitment to reconciliation, I want to invite and ask Elder Verna McGregor to open our time together in ceremony. Elder McGregor is from the Algonquin community of Kitigan, Zibi, Anishinaabe, and works in Minashwan Lodge, which is the Aboriginal Human Support Centre in Ottawa on the unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. Elder McGregor, thank you so much for joining us and for starting our time together in a good way. To honor the traditional customs, I want to offer you this tobacco and invite you to open our time together. Thank you so much.
Oh, me good, Sarah. Hello, everybody. I look a little disheveled because we had technical issues, but I'm honored to be here today with this important issue. We, as Algonquin people, we were the first to meet the explorers here, and most notably Samuel de Champlain bringing them down the river, and so began our journey here. For us, we're known as the birch bark canoe. But one of the significant why Ottawa was such an important meeting place was that it's the confluence of the rivers coming together from the four directions, and we would meet here and talk about what's going on with the children. And again, they're the most sacred in our understandings, especially the first 7 years of life. That sets the stage for their journey here, for the rest of their journey. And that's why it was so important for their growth and their first start. So this initiative, Children First, is so important. And again, too, as well, the issues that are going to be raised by Sarah and Children First also guide us along this journey here for the well-being of the children. So again, too, why are children so, our understanding too as well is because they are, as one elder said, they're fresh from the Creator, and they come here too as well with their own ways of knowing already. And so we nurture them. And our biggest understanding is that we're here for the next 7 generations. So again, I have a little smudge split, and the significance of that is also too, as well as our connection it's to ground us, to remember that what's our responsibility, especially to the next 7 generations. And I'm going to say a little prayer in the language to honor our responsibility and to honor us coming together today to talk about this important issue. So I say, miigwech, kajemanido, onjenigoshkito jimando, sekoje nongo, mame kakina pomatsajik, wido kwa kakina, mam de gain and double no G-shuk, and don't nizoje nongo mamwe, onje kakina nijino and dog, mam de gain and up no G-shuk, miigwech onje kakina gagisha and dononje, mam de gain in the kimanon, miigwech onje kakina nebi, nasewen, ashich ishkode. Shwedish no nabikis, miigwech onje kakina nijino and alkana, and go with non mashom, sanana shich. The Boschka dogmag. We go to the Kakina suck. To Miss no God shake me, Jim Widgick. Conscious got negway de seaman, Kego, Jim on the Doshit Con and Notch Christian negway de seaman, we do quack Kakina on the gay, we weave the jick. The mog is jick. Kaye, we give a jick a shit, Schwin Mishno, me gwetch. What I'm saying is just thank you, Creator, for allowing us to come together, and please guide us well in our gathering today. And I say thank you for the 4 elements that are necessary for life on the medicine wheel, which includes the earth, the air, the water, the fire. And I thank all creation and for allowing us to come together here. And I look forward to the important words again that Children First brings to this issue. And I say, miigwech, thank you.
Miigwech, thank you so much, Verna. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. This is our fourth in an annual series of events to profile Raising Canada and to mobilize action on the top 10 threats to childhood. Whether you're joining us for the first time or whether you've been with us since the beginning, our goal is always to rally Canadians around a shared vision that together we can make Canada the best place in the world for kids to grow up. This year, our Raising Canada report involved a wide range of experts. Our lead researcher, Sydney Campbell, worked with a team of youth advisors, along with adult leaders from research institutes, children's charities, and partners like Statistics Canada. The best way that I can sum up Raising Canada is that it is a barometer on the state of our nation's soul. Indeed, Nelson Mandela is quoted as saying that there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. Well, Raising Canada makes it clear that our society's soul is in deep trouble. Not surprisingly, Raising Canada has continued to make national news headlines and been widely shared on national media and on social media. And one of the reasons that the report continues to garner such widespread attention is that it busts persistent myths about what it's like to be a kid in Canada today. Raising Canada sounds the alarm and it seeks to awake the conscience of our nation. This year, the top 10 threats include deteriorating mental health, food insecurity, infant mortality, as well as increasing rates of child abuse, systemic racism, poverty, and more. The state of childhood in Canada is rapidly declining. In fact, it's reached a tipping point. Earlier this year, Children First Canada joined forces with children's hospitals and charities in declaring Code Pink. It's a term that describes a pediatric emergency, and we called on all levels of government for an emergency response. We were not overstating it to declare it a pediatric crisis. Children's lives were and continue to be in jeopardy. Children's hospitals and charities have reported grave increases in eating disorders, suicide attempts, opioid use, self-harm, and child abuse. Children with disabilities and complex medical needs have been cut off from essential treatments and surgeries, along with rehabilitation. The numbers are grave, and the stories behind them are heartbreaking, because these aren't just stats, they are real children. Your children, my children, all of our children. Children made enormous sacrifices to protect their elders and keep our country safe throughout the pandemic, but as a society, we have failed them. They gave up school, soccer practice, dance lessons, play dates, birthday parties, visits with their grandparents, and so much more. Their rights to an education, survival, and development have been largely ignored, and the consequences will be felt for years to come. When we declared Code Pink, we were optimistic that the federal and provincial governments would step up and intervene. But here we are, months later, and Code Pink remains in effect. The lives of 8 million kids have been upended, and some have suffered more than others. The theme of inequity cuts across all the top 10 threats, as First Nations, Métis and Inuit children, Black and other racialized children, children with disabilities, and LGBTQS+ youth were particularly hard hit. Currently, more than 6 million kids under the age of 12 remain unvaccinated. My own son is one of them, and I know how stressful it is for kids and parents to be facing this fourth wave. This is the third school year in a row that schools have been disrupted, and already dozens of schools have already been forced to shut down, and many more are soon to follow. Parents like myself and many of you watching are eagerly awaiting news of vaccine approvals for younger kids, yet many provinces still don't have a vaccine rollout strategy in place. And investments in children's mental and physical health have been woefully inadequate. I'm often asked which of the Raising Canada data is most shocking. And to be honest with you, what shocks me most is that despite the overwhelming evidence that the kids are not all right, so little has been done to intervene. It's time for Canada to take a stand. That's why Raising Canada 2021 doesn't just point to the problems, it also points to the solutions. And it includes a call to action signed by our Council of Champions, calling on our federal and provincial leaders to put children at the heart of Canada's pandemic recovery plans. Children have a right to survive and thrive, and this will require leadership and commitment at all levels, including parents, policymakers, the private sector, doctors, teachers, all of us. It will also require leadership of kids themselves. When young people are informed and engaged, better decisions are made within our families, schools, and in government. This year, youth were involved in every aspect of Raising Canada as advisors, analyzing the data, shaping the recommendations, and acting as spokespeople. You'll see today some of the artwork that kids created to help communicate the ways that they have experienced the top 10 threats. Some of those images are funny and sweet. Others are deeply poignant and heart-wrenching. They are a window into the lives of children and a powerful reminder that children have deeply held feelings about the life that they are living and the life that they deserve. Today, we'll also be joined by several youth during our panel and the Q&A, because it's going to take all of us, children, youth, and adults, working together to put children first. So on that note, I want to say a very special thank you to all of you for being here today, for giving your time and energy to improving the lives of children. I also want to say a special thanks to the people and organizations who helped make this possible. Thank you to the TD Bank Group, the TD Ready Commitment, as our presenting sponsor. And thanks to our national partners, SureCall, CHEO, Sick Kids, and the Alberta Child Health Research Institute. And of course, thank you to our amazing team who works so hard, including our staff, youth advisors, Council of Champions, subject matter experts, and our board. Now I have a couple of brief reminders for you as our participants. First, please be sure to sign into the chat box so that you can submit your questions and comments and see announcements throughout the event. And second, please help us raise awareness and spread the news beyond these virtual walls by posting on social media and using the hashtags Raising Canada and Children First. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce our event moderator. Amber Mack is an award-winning podcaster, TV host, and best-selling author. She's also an internationally known technology reporter, entrepreneur, and social media personality. In addition to numerous professional accolades, she's also a mother and a passionate champion for the health of kids through our Code Pink campaign and many other causes. Amber, we are so honored to have you hosting our event today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. And it's a real honor for me to be involved in Code Pink and Raising Canada. As you mentioned, I'm the mom of a 12-year-old. And for the past 18 months, I just feel like many parents as though the ground has been shaking underneath us. Never before as a parent have I worried so much about both his mental health as well as his physical health. And even as you're saying, Sarah, that this is the third school year that they've been disrupted because of the pandemic, it's just hard to believe we are still in this situation. And we still aren't making children a priority. And this is something that keeps me up every single night, along with parents all across the country. It's a really devastating time. So I'm going to introduce each of our panelists, and then we have a question for each of them before we go into a broader conversation and then turn to the audience for more questions. First up, we have Ray Steeves, climate justice activist and member of the Young Canadians Parliament. Hello, Ray.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here. Next up, we have Dr. Alika Lafontaine, who is president-elect of the Canadian Medical Association and Indigenous health advocate, anesthesiologist from Grand Prairie, Alberta. Hello.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. We also have Naki Osute, who is Associate Vice President, Social Impact, Global Corporate Citizenship at TD Bank. Hello.
Hi, Amber. Thank you for having us.
And finally, we have Dr. Catherine Smart, President 2021 to 2022 of the Canadian Medical Association and a pediatrician in Whitehorse in the Yukon. Hello. As I mentioned before, we do have people from coast to coast to coast, and I have done dozens of virtual events over the past year and a half. And from a geographic perspective, this is definitely the most diverse. So excited for this conversation. I'm going to throw out a question to each of our panelists to kick things off. And my first question is for you, Ray. The question is this: one of the messages that came out loud and clear in the report is that youth aren't just leaders of the future. They are leaders like you of today. How can government, charities, and the private sector better support youth to really engage in conversations and decision-making on issues that matter to you and other youth, such as climate change?
So my generation has proven time and time again that we will not only show up, but lead and create these movements for climate and social justice over the past few years. We are capable, passionate, and knowledgeable enough to have a seat at the table, even on a political level, as I think the priority for who gets to have a seat at the table should be passion and not age. However, I know that the youth that I work with have been really struggling recently. It is very difficult to grow up and have a lot of our childhood dominated by writing speeches, Zoom calls, and media interviews. However exciting and empowering it is. The only thing that we really want from politicians and people with power is respect, as with respect will follow opportunities, inclusion, and age diversity. Youth often get a seat in the room, but not only a place at the table. And the biggest way to support us is by government figures taking meaningful action and not only listening to what we have to say, but trying to learn from us and respect what we have to say.
It's a really good point. We know that children are rarely involved in any type of policy decisions. And I love what you said, that it's really more about passion and not about your age. And thank you again for being here. My next question is for Dr. LaFontaine. Being a physician, you've seen firsthand the impact of the pandemic on young people. Can we talk a little bit about, while there has definitely been an overall reduction in children attending emergency departments with unintentional and preventable injuries, there's been a steady rise in the rate of children dying from opioid-related deaths and an increase in poisonings and cannabis ingestions. This is probably something a lot of people who are watching don't know about. So tell us a little bit more about the severity of the situation.
I'll maybe just touch a little bit on the previous answers. So I have a 13-year-old. I have 4 kids. One of the things that really gives me hope about the future is seeing youth rise up and feel some of this leadership deficit that we're currently facing. The reality is we need kids at the table, because those at the table aren't actually making great decisions. And when we talk about things like overdoses from drugs of addiction and marijuana and other things, it really reflects poor decisions, I think, from adults, as far as creating these safe environments for kids, not only to be kids, but also have their voice heard around these tables. We know that we don't do a great job at supporting those who suffer with addiction. We know that we haven't properly resourced the things that we know end up working. There are approaches that mitigate overdoses, harm reduction, providing those environments to understand what is actually triggering people using these substances. And to a great degree, I think the overdose epidemic and these increases in having children over in emergency rooms reflects the lack of mental health support that they often have, and that they're trying to manage their own lives and the emotions that we all go through when we were growing up within this context of a pandemic and less support for everyone. And so I think the real solution to a lot of these things is to recognize that, number one, it is a problem. Our kids are suffering. Our kids are not okay in the midst of this pandemic. And then to move forward and, in partnership with them, actually start to solve these problems and support them in the way that they need to be supported.
It's a really good point. Just as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the last year and a half, and you mentioned the absence of leadership in so many areas, and it has been so devastating on our youth. Nikki, I want to come to you for the next question. TD has been a huge supporter in helping to improve adolescent health across Canada, and a key partner and champion for Children First Canada to produce this very important report. Can you share why investing in improving adolescent health is so important for TD?
Thank you for the question. Yes, off the top, Sarah mentioned the TD Ready commitment. And when we set out to launch the TD Ready commitment back in 2018, the health of youth was built right into the strategy. Where we think a lot about the importance of people feeling confident about their health so they can feel confident about their future. And when we talk about people, we're including youth in that category. So that's why for us, making investments in technology, research, innovative solutions that can improve access to care for everyone, including youth and adolescents, has been a priority. And the work of Children First and the Raising Canada report has been an integral part of that. Never has there been a time where health has been more top of mind than today, and impacting all facets of life as we know it. And that's particularly true for children and adolescents. The pandemic has essentially redefined what a day in the life of a child looks like. So it's imperative that we make investments to help provide children and youth with the right supports now so that they can have a brighter future.
Well, thank you so much for that. And you're absolutely right. And we're going to dive into that further. Dr. Smart, in the foreword of the report, you state, although the COVID-19 pandemic will surely be remembered as one of the defining events in modern Canadian history, cutting across all generations, no generation will have experienced a greater impact than children. And it will be some time before we fully appreciate the impact of this disruption on their formative year. I wanted to ask you to expand on that because when we think about the future and the impact that the past has had, I imagine we're just not prepared for it. So expand on why you said these words and what we can do about the future that lies ahead.
Thank you for that. I think so much of the way children and youth have been considered during this pandemic just shows the lack of awareness often of our leaders and politicians and communities at large in terms of the impact. I think there's unfortunately been too much of a discussion about, oh, COVID isn't serious in children because children are less likely to be hospitalized or die, as though somehow that's the metric that matters when it comes to kids. And what we know is children and youth have been profoundly impacted by this pandemic in so many ways. And these impacts will be long lasting because these are their formative years. You know, losing 1 or 2 years of school at this age is very different than being an adult and maybe having to slow down your social interactions for a couple of years. You know, children are alone, they're alienated. Some children are only finding safety at school and they've lost that touch point with adults in their life who might be safe. We're seeing so much mental health issues come to bear from that isolation. And that's, again, something that we already had a system that was not adequately addressing. And now those numbers are increasing and we don't have solutions or leadership of how to solve those problems. What I see so much as a pediatrician is that the challenges that children and youth face are often silent because they're not overflowing our hospitals, they're not filling up our ICUs, and they often suffer on their own with their families, out of the lens, out of the dialogue that's happening. And I really am grateful that this report and this discussion today is shining a light on children and youth and what they're going through, so we can really start recognizing these challenges and calling on leadership to prioritize children in planning and funding so that their challenges and issues can be acknowledged and addressed moving forward.
Dr. Smart, I want to move on to the group questions, but I want to stick with you for 1 second, because just as we've had opening questions for all of our panelists today, and as everybody's speaking, the topic of leadership comes up more and more again, is that we lack the leadership. So Dr. Smart, why do you think it is that leaders of today are not considering the impact that the past year and a half has had on the next generation?
I think it's for a lot of reasons. I think we're seeing our leaders pulled in a lot of directions and they're sort of putting out fires in the system because so many aspects of our healthcare system and our other systems were not functioning well even prior to the pandemic. So now we're left with sort of band-aids and trying to run around dealing with that. And I think what we're losing sight of in that is that long-term view and the impact of how things like the health of children and youth are going to impact our society in the long term. I think also, you know, when we think about children and youth, we have to realize, just like we were hearing from Elder Verna, that their wellness and their trajectory in life starts in that first 7 years of life. If we are not focused on that, not creating the best possible environment for children to grow and thrive early on, we are not going to see the outcomes we want long term. But those types of investments, that type of acknowledgement is generally not necessarily of interest to politicians because it's longer than any political mandate. These are investments where we're going to see the payoffs 20, 30 years from now. So I think we need to really call on politicians to be more collaborative and to commit to investments and approaches to complex problems that will pay off in the long term. It has to be about more than just getting elected in the next 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's a key point, and probably more diversity in leadership as well, in terms of people who can make sure that these issues are prioritized. So we're going to open up for the next 20 to 30 minutes to more of a group conversation. And I know these things are hard in the virtual environment, but I'm going to bounce around in terms of asking questions to each of you. I wanted to talk to you, Dr. LaFontaine, about food insecurity. And we know while income is a major driver of food insecurity, what policy or program recommendations can we make to address the geographic barriers to providing access to healthy, culturally appropriate food for children in the North?
So interestingly, I was actually part of a task force that studied this very topic back in 2013 with an organization called Action Canada. So we published a report then looking at Nunavut and food insecurity and the use of local foods as a way to, treat the problem. So I think one of the big things to acknowledge is that different cultures have different ways of providing the necessities of life in a way that's not just culturally appropriate, but also sustainable. And historically, we've had different approaches by government that have tried to create kind of a mass adoption of, different food groups and different approaches that perhaps wasn't great policy decisions. And so a big part of food insecurity, especially for rural, remote places in Canada, is supporting the ability of those communities to produce and provide food for the community themselves. And to acknowledge that as part of that, governments can support through policy as well as through science, the things that these communities need as far as knowledge and resources, etc. I think food insecurity, just in general, both within urban and rural populations, needs to be acknowledged as well. Children going hungry doesn't just happen in the far north within Nunavut. It also happens in downtown Edmonton and Calgary. And the importance of food and resolving food insecurity for these kids is central to making sure that they have those healthy environments that a lot of the panelists have talked about. And maybe those come in the form of, food programs. Maybe that comes in the form of after school programs. I know when I was growing up, my parents were actually part of an after school food program that ensured I had food security growing up in urban Regina. And so all of these things, I think, kind of work together in order to resolve this problem and making sure that youth are at the table to make sure that the things that we're suggesting actually, when we implement them, are going to be adopted by youth and children, I think is really, really important.
So, Dr. LaFontaine, I want to ask just a super quick follow-up to that, because I'm thinking as you're speaking about the impact of schools being closed on food security for children. So how important is it that we continue to make sure that schools are open for our children?
So we do know from the previous waves and this current wave of COVID-19 that the back and forth of in-school, at-home programming for schools has not been good for kids. The in-person learning environment is sometimes the best for the majority of children, not just for those resources for learning, but also access to programs like we're talking about right now. And so that extends to other choices that we're making as adults. Ensuring that we're creating environments that are safe through enforcing public health guidelines, improving ventilation within schools, mandatory masking, mandatory vaccinations. All of these things work together to ensure that kids can be in those environments that they function the best. And if you want to know whether or not these work, I just reach out to kids and ask them directly.
Thank you so much for that. Dr. Smart, according to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, young people have rights to be involved in decisions that impact their lives, to have their views acknowledged and also meaningfully considered. What can private and public sectors do to try and involve young people in mitigating the top 10 threats and strive towards making Canada the best place in the world for kids to grow up?
I think that is so important to acknowledge that children and youth have so much knowledge, ideas, and solutions for the problems that they face. And, that's something that I'm always amazed by in my work as a pediatrician. It's just how much insight even young children, but particularly, preteens and teenagers have into the world around them, the complexity of problems and the solutions that they bring to the table. So I think we really need to look at how we can bring the voice of youth to the decision-making table. They should be present when decisions are being made about them. And I think we're really seeing that push in general with more awareness around equity, diversity, and inclusion, is that we shouldn't be talking about people or making decisions about people who aren't in the room. And I would say that absolutely should extend to children and youth as well. And so I think, with private partnerships and public government levels, we should be striving more to hear the voices of future Canadians and taking their wisdom and accounting for it in the decisions we make as adults.
It's also great that we're including youth on this panel today, because so often
Absolutely.
I see these conversations taking place where there are no young people. And I want to go over to Ray for this next question. We have really seen during this pandemic that people have rallied around our seniors. I've been involved in a number of different programs, one called Long-Term Care Frontline Food, making sure that our seniors had hot meals in long-term care homes. We've not really seen the same concern and rallying behind children. Keep in mind that I also live in a province where they shut down playgrounds for about 24 hours and just stopped kids from going to those playgrounds because they thought it was unsafe without a lot of evidence of that. So can you talk a little bit about why you think that young people's voices are not being elevated and heard to the same extent as other communities?
Yeah, well, there's this underlying pressure that all activists have to fix everything and kind of take these mass global problems into their own hands. But then with youth, there's this extra fight that we have to first off be taking seriously. So youth have to work extra hard to get the same amount of change that adults could done that adults could get. And that also combined with the fact that children's issues are so intersectional and it is so complicated and hard to process and therefore act on these issues, which I feel like could be a reason why people may be putting it off. And also because children are people that can oftentimes suffer in silence, I guess, because they don't always have, especially really young children don't always have the resources to advocate for themselves. So they can often go unnoticed and people may not even understand that there's a problem in the first place.
I think you make a really good point. And I would also argue that when kids are in school, we tend to think and hear more about kids and the challenges that they face versus when they're out of school and they're silenced in some ways. Naki, I wanted to continue this conversation about the impact of school. We're only a month into the new school year. We're already hearing reports of schools being at risk of closing down, more cases during the fourth wave. From your perspective, how has the pandemic helped to expose the importance of schools and education as a gateway to children's rights and to protection of their health? And what lessons have we learned from all of this? And would love your perspective from the private sector.
Absolutely. I mean, the pandemic really shone a light on the fact that youth need to learn in an environment that fosters a sense of community. Dr. LaFontaine referenced this earlier as well. We need to see our youth in community and connection. From a private sector perspective, we sought to recognize. We found that there were a number of initiatives that we could develop to support and offset some of the effects of the pandemic on youth. For example, earlier this year, when we started to really see the impact of school closures and developing alternative ways of teaching, left schools understandably overwhelmed and unequipped to respond when the pandemic really went into full swing. But further than that, and to some of the research within the Raising Canada report, we're seeing predictions of students across North America to be experiencing significant learning loss due to the remote and virtual learning circumstances that they're under. And so as a bank, recognizing that this learning loss will not affect all students equally, and that greater burden will be placed on children and communities that are in low income households with limited access to the internet, communities that have been historically excluded and marginalized, Indigenous communities, racialized communities, students with disabilities. So in response, we developed our first our fourth annual edition of the TD Ready Challenge to directly seek out solutions to help address what we're understanding to be predicted learning loss. So this is going to be an initiative that really focuses on support for the development of innovative, impactful, and measurable solutions to address learning loss.
Yeah, it's absolutely a real issue. I was just mentioning before this event, I'm hearing from a lot of parents that when their kids are getting back in school, they're being approached by teachers saying, you've lost a lot of the school year over the past year and a half, and we need to catch up, and we need to catch up. And this really leads me to the next question I have for Dr. LaFontaine, because even just that stress on children to be thinking about all of this time lost and not being in school. Dr. LaFontaine, can you talk a little bit about mental health, something that we know has been a growing issue for people of all ages over the past few years, but especially over the past year and a half? What are you seeing right now in terms of the effects on children and even parents when it comes to stress and anxiety and other mental health issues?
So when I was in grade school, I was labeled developmentally delayed. And so I've experienced that stress firsthand of lacking resources within the health or within the education system in order to push you forward to kind of that expected stage. My second oldest has, learning and speech delay. And so as parents, we've been trying to work through this as we've been thrust into, this online learning environment and how to best support him and the rest of my children as well. I think that the burden that children carry nowadays, not only to identify the problems that are there and advocate for the things that they need, but also being asked to lead the way in kind of resolving these things, it has a very heavy mental strain on them. You add the context of this environment where parents are now under stress, where not only are they being asked to teach, but they're also being asked to work, is obviously creating these environments where kids are increasingly not feeling the stability and consistency that you need kind of moving forward. The education system is going to be very, very, very similar to the healthcare system moving forward. We're going to have to acknowledge that the place that we're in right now is not very good. There are problems that are just a side effect of not preparing well. And after acknowledging, just owning those problems and then creating ways to support people moving forward. We don't need a once in a generation investment in the health system. We also need it within the education system as well. And for these learners, these young kids, to be thrust into, the role that we often reserve for adults where, in college, you're responsible for your own learning. This is not something that we usually ask our kids and children to carry. And we have to acknowledge that that's a very heavy burden to bear. And it's going to have consequences for years moving forward.
Absolutely. Before I move on to Ray, I wanted to ask Dr. Smart a similar question about the mental health of children and Canadians. How big of an issue do you see this right now in terms of the effects of the past year and a half and going forward as well?
I think it's an absolutely huge issue, and it's on the backdrop of a mental health system that was already profoundly under-resourced before the pandemic. So I think that's important to understand. We have never had adequate recognition of mental health challenges or services to meet the needs of people struggling with their mental health. And I think what's really important to understand with children is when children are dealing with mental health challenges, it impacts the whole family, and often the mental health challenges they're experiencing have roots in the family's own challenges. So we see things like intergenerational trauma, parents who have their own mental health challenges, parents who have not been adequately supported in terms of their ability to work at a job that's, rewarding, sustainable, not toxic, their ability to earn a living wage, their ability to provide the necessities of life for their children, and all those stress manifest in the home and impact children. So I think, we have to start realizing that to really help kids, we have to help families. We have to realize that children live with caregivers, they live in community. And if all those layers around them are not well, those children won't be well. And we don't have systems right now that work that way or address those things. And again, it creates inequities because so much of what exists in our mental health system exists outside of universal health care. So who can access it is limited. And that really impacts a lot of the children that I see and work with. And it needs to be addressed, or we are going to have a real dramatic problem in this country as we move forward.
Ray, I wanted to come to you and ask you probably a difficult question in many ways, because I think many people are wondering, how are children doing today? So my question for you is, what has life been like during the pandemic for you and your friends?
It's definitely, I mean, it's been obviously completely different than anything before. I know that like a lot of the people that I know personally have been struggling really easy, like very commonly, like the things that it's been like really normalized to have like really severe mental health problems now with my friends. And yes, normalized mental health, but to the point where it's just kind of we kind of just have a feeling that everyone's struggling, like in our classrooms and everything. And so it definitely hasn't been easy, but then again, we don't really know what it's like to grow up without it. Like we've never, like for me, I never had like a teenage year because I'm 15 now. So COVID would have started when I was like 13 or so. So I never really had like a teenage year that COVID did not exist in. So I don't exactly know what the difference would be per se. But I definitely would be easier without COVID. And a lot of people have been struggling. But now that schools are back, it definitely has been better. But there's still some lasting effects of the pandemic on people at school. And especially for the fact that we've been isolated for so long and haven't really been doing much, just putting everyone, as much as good as schools are, it definitely has been really overwhelming to kind of just head back into everything full force after a while of just not doing much.
Ray, just a quick follow-up. Do you feel as though you and your friends have the resources that you need when it comes to mental health help?
The resources are definitely out there, and I know a lot of friends that have reached out and have been better off for it, but it is very difficult to reach out to these places. And so while they may be there, they're not always, it is much easier said than done to actually reach out to them. But there definitely has been some, but I do think that there needs to be children, like people don't really know that they're there in the first place.
It's a really good point. I do want to just remind people that in a few minutes, we are going to go to audience questions, and we encourage you to ask a question. I see a couple are coming in already, but questions are so important. And I would say, don't even feel as though it has to be a question, even if you have a comment or an experience that you want to share. This is what this hour and a half is all about. So please don't hesitate to share with us or ask a question. So I wanted to move over to Nikki for a second and ask a question about the private sector. I know we touched on the role of the private sector when it comes to dealing with the well-being of the next generation, but I was wondering if you can expand a little bit on this. We see the great work that TD is doing, but what would you say to other people who are watching right now in the private sector, knowing that most people think when it comes to the well-being of children, it's a responsibility of government and parents, and they don't see that role that the private sector can play?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a very commonly held perspective. But when we think about it, private sector organizations are in the business of supporting people. And so naturally, if you're in the business of supporting people, and we recognize that health, well-being, mental health is a top concern for the people that we're trying to serve through our business, then of course that needs to be a top concern for us as well. And that includes a focus on improving adolescent health and well-being as well. And of course, I agree, parents and governments have a responsibility of advancing the well-being of young people, but the private sector can certainly support that. And we can do that through our influence, through building awareness around issues. I think about the case at TD. We are an organization that across North America employs 90,000 people. So imagine the kind of awareness that we can build if we're able to bring these issues to our employee base. Philanthropy, of course, is another vehicle that we can use to help drive tangible and inclusive and equitable change. And I mentioned the TD Ready Challenge as one of the mechanisms we're utilizing to address predicted learning loss. But it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's also about really engaging the fullness of our resources. I mentioned the 90,000 the 90,000 employee population, many of whom are avid volunteers who can help to support organizations like Children First and other organizations who are working in this space. In addition to that, we also look at how the different ways that our different lines of business can also support through pro bono and skills-based volunteering as well. So I think, between all of, between influence, between philanthropy, between the engagement of our employees, there are many ways that private sector can support these efforts.
Just as you were speaking, I was reminded of a client that I work with all the time, Salesforce. And one of the things that they do is that in San Francisco, where they're headquartered, is that they volunteer to adopt a school in their area. And they're responsible for volunteering at that school. And that's something that they do during their normal work hours. So this type of thing, as you're saying, I mean, it's an important thing for private sector to take on.
Exactly. That's a great example too.
Question for you, Dr. Smart, and we're just a few minutes away from getting to our audience questions. And I know people have been listening patiently, and we will get to the audience questions in just a couple of minutes. One of the persistent threats to children's health in Canada is systemic racism and discrimination. I'm glad that we're having more of these conversations, but it's certainly not enough. So can you talk about how data can help us understand the realities for marginalized populations to really illuminate the problems and help to point us towards better solutions?
So much of what we've seen during this COVID pandemic is a lack of national accessible data to really understand what is happening and where. And certainly when it comes to groups that are marginalized and disproportionately impacted by things like COVID, early in the pandemic, it was really challenging to understand what exactly was going on. And it was only when individual health units, like for example, out of Toronto, really started bringing forth data showing that racialized and marginalized groups of people were being disproportionately impacted due to their workplace settings and other factors, that we were able to start to take targeted action. And I think that same issue extends to children and youth, to really understand the impacts of racism in our system, to impact the issues around being from traditionally marginalized or racialized communities and how that impacts youth and their futures. We need to be tracking that data, following it, and then also using it to design targeted interventions and then measuring the impact of those interventions so we can scale up things that are successful. I often say if you don't define the problem, it's hard to have solutions, and data is part of understanding the problem we're trying to solve.
Yeah, I mean, we're swimming in data right now. It's just about analyzing it and figuring out, like you said, the right solutions. And this is a challenge for the future. We do want to transition into questions from the audience, and this is a good one to start with. So this question came in through registration, and it sticks with the theme that we've been talking about. It's for you, Dr. LaFontaine. Dental decay is a common chronic disease of childhood, and COVID-19 has made dental treatment less accessible. Can you talk about what can be done to create a more comprehensive and accessible public dental health policy for Canadian children and youth, knowing that so many of them don't have access, and during the past year and a half have probably avoided going altogether, even if they had access?
So, dental care is a good example of how problems that pre-existed COVID have been magnified and made worse. So we know that dental care is not covered under the public health system, that you need private insurance that sometimes is very expensive or limiting as far as how many times you can go for cleanings and other types of advanced treatment. We also know that dental care is extremely important in just the development of a child. Having a smile that you can be confident in, as well as just the mechanics of being able to chew your food and not have pain, are extremely important as far as growth and development. I think there were things that we used to do in the past that we've defunded. Having visiting nurses and dental therapists and dentists coming to schools, both within rural, remote, and urban centers, in order to share information about how to provide good dental hygiene, offering free sort of assessments and possible care on site. These are things that we used to do that have kind of fallen to the wayside as we've decided to fund different priorities. And also other things like public health interventions. Having fluoride within drinking water is extremely important as far as ensuring that kids in general get access to some type of dental support as they're growing and developing. And so I think when you're looking at the solutions, we should look at the past and what used to work well. We used to have very good public health dental health interventions that were school-based and community-based, that we've moved on to, other ways of treating it and kind of leaving it to, the community to sort of figure out. We need leadership from political circles and political leadership to make sure we can get back to having those programs in place and supporting our kids.
Yeah, Dr. LaFontaine, just as you were speaking, I'm here in Prince Edward Island visiting my family for Thanksgiving, and I grew up in a very rural area here. And I haven't thought about this in dozens of years, but I do remember there used to be a bus that would come to our rural school that had the dentist on it, and kids would go on the bus to get checked out. And I'm sure they don't do that anymore. We don't even have rural schools because they've all been consolidated. But there are perhaps some things that we did in the past, like you said, that we should bring back. Dr. Smart, just wanted you to quickly touch on this conversation. I know you were listening and nodding your head. What do you think can be done about problems that have been accelerated like this during the pandemic?
It is an absolutely huge issue. I see this in my patient population all the time. And again, another example of children that live in rural and remote settings being even more disproportionately impacted is they often need to travel to receive dental services. So I absolutely agree. We need to really work with community, children and youth to solve these problems. We need to get away from centralizing everything in big centers and not having community-based solutions, because that puts up so many barriers for populations that are traditionally marginalized. Dental health is of critical importance. I can tell you here in the Yukon, the resources that are put into it are totally inadequate. I see children having to wait upwards of 18 to 24 months to have sedated dental care if that's what's required. Again, children with disabilities are disproportionately impacted because things like sedation are limited in terms of access. So it needs to be recognized as something that needs to be part of universal healthcare. It needs to be adequately funded, and it needs to be decentralized so that it's more accessible.
All great points. I'm going to switch now to audience questions. And I do, again, want to encourage you to ask as many questions as possible. We have a few to get us started. We also have some special video messages that we'll get to in just a couple of minutes. There are 3 that have been sent in. The first question we have here is from Craig. And the question is, how can we move from doing the work to you to for you, getting more voices at the table? Typically on a panel like this, I like to call in a specific person, but I'm just wondering if there's anyone who wants to raise their hands who can answer this question for Craig. Who wants to take a go at? All right, Dr. LaFontaine.
Yeah, I think just the thinking behind the question I agree with, but one of the things that I think we all need to acknowledge is that the reason why we need people around the table who aren't there is because we're actually making really bad decisions. So when it comes to youth and the things that they need, we're not actually providing those things. And so one of the reasons why having them at the table is making sure that they're visible and they're speaking to things that we may not see because they're in our blind spots.
And if I can just add to that, I think even I might even offer a modification to the question to say, how can we do more with youth as opposed to for youth? And I think we dealt with this a little bit earlier, I think, around why haven't we seen this sooner? And part of it is I don't know that we've built a practice of engaging youth in decision-making in general. And it strikes me that there's an opportunity to do that. I was at a conference in Ottawa a few years ago hosted by the Future of Good. And what they did was at conferences where you have breakout groups, the youth were essentially moderating and we're the report back person for each of the table groups. So they were able to insert their thoughts and ideas, and they weren't simply a visible participant, but they were actually in a leadership role in the reporting back for each of their tables. So I think if we can start to build these practices in, then we don't have to, then when we get to a situation like a pandemic, we're used to this. We've already normalized it. And I think that's a direction I'd love to see us move towards.
It's an excellent point. I mean, and that's a theme that's been coming up over and over again, is we have to involve youth in these conversations about things that affect their lives. And it's also a great time to introduce one of our videos that was sent in. We have a video from Milind Kumar from the Youth Council, a Youth Council member for CHIO, who has sent in a message for all of us.
Hey everyone, my name's Milind Kumar. I'm 18 years old, I'm from Ottawa, and I'm affiliated with CHEO's Youth Forum since I've been a regular patient at CHEO for the past 2 years. And here's my question for you today. Throughout the pandemic, I, along with millions of other Canadian students, have had our social lives substantially altered. From doing online school, to not seeing our friends, or even attending large gatherings, which has resulted in greater mental health hospitalizations and significant impacts on child development. What specifically can be done so that youth like myself, along with other children, are supported both currently and moving forward? Thank you.
It's a great question and something I think we all want to get an answer to. Dr. Smart, do you want to take a go at just answering that question and figuring out what more can be done?
Thank you so much for that question. And I think, on so many levels, we need to see more action really everywhere to bring youth in, to make things accessible to youth. And I think a first step is a bit what brought you to the question, which is you're involved in a panel at CHEO, you're involved in decision making and letting us know what things work for youth, what the blind spots might be, and how people aren't always being included where they need to be. And I think that's, again, like we've been talking about, the first step is not assuming that we've defined the problem properly or have the right solutions. So I think we sometimes need to step back and understand what we have that's working, what we have that's not working, where people are being missed, people that have maybe been forgotten, and how we can bring them to the table and include them in solutions as we move forward.
Ray, maybe I can go to you as well, and perhaps you can give us some advice from your perspective. Obviously, you're an activist. I'm sure you know lots of the activists across the country. But what can all of us do as both parents or people in the private sector to get more young people involved, to have a voice and be part of these conversations?
So first off, youth definitely need to be involved more in these types of conversations, but we do need to establish a healthy balance, because as much as we genuinely need to be involved with these conversations to make things equal for kids, almost every single person that I work with as an activist is incredibly overworked, incredibly stressed, and I do a lot of climate and social justice activism, and a lot of the reasons that we're doing this is simply because adults are not doing it, and so we need to be involved, but we also need to just be kids, and we haven't been able to be kids with COVID happening. And so one of the things that we need the most is to be involved, but also just let us be children, and not, because it's very difficult to have a normal childhood when you feel like constantly you have to speak up for everybody else on a political level.
It's a really good point. We are asking a lot of your generation and those younger. I feel like we should have a formal apology on behalf of all the adults who are screwing things up right now, because you're absolutely right. I mean, you should have that opportunity just to be kids, and at the same time, your voice is important. Dr. LaFontaine, maybe I can come to you just listening to Ray speak. What do you think of her comments, and just, how do we find that balance for kids?
Yeah, and I echo what Ray's saying. I hear the same thing from my 13-year-old. Kids want us to be adults and actually make decisions so we can lead them out of these problems. Although kids can advocate and help us to understand our blind spots, at the end of the day, we still hold these places of power. We're still the ones who actually have jobs to fix these problems. I would never expect a child to come in for anesthesia and tell me how to provide the anesthetic. That's ridiculous. Right. And so we're often putting kids in this position where we're asking them to lead and for us to follow, when really what they're asking for is for us to lead and for them to follow. There's things that we know are going to keep kids in school. We know mandatory vaccinations, creating environments where social distancing and other public health guidelines are implemented, improving ventilation in schools, for kids being able to attend large events, having some sort of workable vaccine passport that doesn't just work within a small community, but also across provincially and nationally, is really important to help kids get back to life as normal. My two girls both dance, and, having clear rules for when they can go, when they can't, that requires a lot of leadership on my part as a parent for them to understand why things happen a certain way. And I look to the government to provide further leadership for me to make sure I don't put them in unsafe situations. This is what kids are asking us to do. And then when they come to the table, having a seed space to figure out what we don't know and whether or not what we're what we're actually trying to do is having the sort of impact that we're hoping that it does.
Absolutely. We do have quite a few questions that are coming in, and we still have a couple more videos. So I do want to get to some of the questions. Dr. Smart, I'm going to ask you this one. This question is about what are some of the unique challenges that children and youth in rural areas are facing right now? I think we touched on some possible solutions, but maybe we can dive further into the challenges that do exist.
I think, one of the biggest challenges I see here in the North is connectivity, especially when schools went virtual, which happened here in the Yukon where I work as well. Again, what we saw is many children and youth did not have access to things that would just be considered basic anywhere else, like the internet. A lot of the communities here, the internet's extremely expensive. Here in Whitehorse, my internet bill's over $200 a month, which is incredible. So you can appreciate for many families, that is a price tag that is far out of reach. And then when you get outside of Whitehorse into rural areas, again, the price tag is high and the quality is low. So that really limited access for children and youth for many things. It limited their access to virtual options for education, but also limited their access to healthcare when we pivoted to virtual care. And we're asking to connect with people either on the phone, people run out of minutes on their phone, or like this over the internet. So that made that challenging. So I think we need to recognize that the cost of some things and the accessibility of it is very different in rural and remote aspects of the country. And then we also need to realize that when people need specialized services like health-related services, that the amount of travel and time that can be involved to move people where they need to be to access the care they need is substantial. And some of the sort of silly jurisdictional issues we have about who's licensed where and providing care across borders can become really challenging for kids that live in the territories and they're trying to access specialized care in another province. Like, for example, for us, we're connected with BC Children's Hospital. Sometimes those licensing issues mean that providers there are not willing to work with our youth or children here in the territory. And then we're having to have people go to Vancouver just simply over a jurisdictional issue. So I think we really need to bring awareness to how being rural and remote can be quite different, and some of these barriers that can be addressed, through things like better funding for internet, but also addressing sort of jurisdictional or sort of bureaucratic rules that limit people's access.
Yeah, I mean, I think the connectivity issue is a big one. I did an event recently for a group in Yellowknife, and they were explaining to me that there was one fiber line that went into the town, but sometimes it got cut because people went out and they just cut it because they could, and then the whole place lost internet connectivity. And this is not that long ago. So we know that it's a real issue that needs much more attention. And then the cost has to be reasonable for all families. So absolutely critical. Nikki, I want to ask you this question. At the individual level, including children and youth in decisions, including them make sense. This is a question that just came in, but how do we do this at a wider systemic level? And I guess, considering Ray's comments about we don't want to put too much pressure on youth, but how do we get youth involved in these conversations? I think you had some good examples of how that's possible. What can be done so it's, less of an impact on them in terms of the stress mentally, but their voices are still heard?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think like most of the things that we've been talking about today, it's about asking youth, how would you like to be involved? What would make sense? And sometimes an appropriate way would be to offer some choice, to say, here are 5 ways. Do any of these resonate? Do any of these make sense to you? If not, what might make sense? And let's actually hear from the youth as to how they'd like to be involved. And I love what Dr. LaFontaine was saying, like as adults, we have a role to play in leading. And I think we can do that by offering options and then providing space for youth to activate their agency through choice.
Yeah, absolutely. A few questions continue to come in. I do want to go to another video that we got in. This one is from Luke Mann, who is a youth from Sick Kids Children's Council. Let's take a look at the video.
Hi. My name is Luke Mann. I'm 16 years old and I am representing the Sick Kids Children's Council located in Toronto. Outside of school, I'm a professional race car driver. Since I started racing, physical activity has been a huge part of my life, and beyond the physical benefits, I have also noticed tremendous mental health benefits. 2 topics mentioned in the report were limited physical activity and poor mental health. I believe there is a chance that these two threats are related, and more specifically, that recent changes in our society, such as the addictive nature of social media, lead to an increasingly sedentary lifestyle, which may be a major cause in the recent decline of mental health. My question is, could there be a correlation between these two threats, and are there any programs or initiatives being planned that could use physical activity as a way to combat this decline in mental health? Thank you.
That's a great question. Dr. LaFontaine, you want to give that one a whirl?
Yeah, so this is a short answer, yes. You're absolutely right. There's a broad body of scientific literature that supports exactly what you said. I think the real question is how do we bring it back? So once again, we've had a shift in public health and, public policy with regards to kids and their exercise. I remember growing up and having phys ed as, a central part of what I did, normalizing participation and sport teams and other things. And I think that you've seen a bit of an expansion as far as what kids can get involved in. I think what we need to emphasize as adults is that activity is actually a very, very good thing for everybody. And moving around and making sure that activity level meets a certain threshold is extremely important at confronting everything from mental health to chronic diseases like diabetes. So absolutely, physical health is a very important thing, and we have to do a better job at structuring programs available to kids to give them a variety of different options that account for the different ways that you can be physically active.
Dr. LaFontaine, I don't know if this is a fair question to ask you, but it's something I've been thinking a lot about. Are there going to be some kids who have just missed out? And I hate to use anecdotal evidence here, but my son before the pandemic was on the basketball team, soccer team, he played baseball, he did everything, was on the swim team, and now he has no interest in doing any of those. It's devastating, really, but are there going to be kids who just slip through the cracks? And I feel like that's a question that's asked here, about a group of children who just, are going to slip through the cracks because of what's happened.
So I think people slip through the cracks because we made poor plans. We allowed those cracks to get wide enough that kids then fell in. There definitely is a link between mental health and, shifts that have happened in the course of this pandemic and kids' desire to actually be physically active. One of the things that I've seen as far as Canadian physicians is that there's a movement towards prescribing, walks in nature and other outdoor activity as a way to actually address some of these mental health issues. And a lot of this is helping kids to understand what they're going through. Why are you feeling the emotions that you are? Why are you responding in the way that you're responding? And as a result, how to move forward and create kind of a different path for yourself. Kids don't want to be inactive. Kids don't want to feel depressed. Kids don't want to feel isolated. And so as adults, just like Nucky was talking about, we have to provide them with different options, and then enable them to take those different options as they move forward with something that works for them. Not every kid's going to want to be on a football team. Not every kid is going to want to be part of the AV club, but both of those can have elements of, physical activity that could be something that supports their mental health. And there are things that you can do at home, even outside of school, in order to make sure that you get that physical activity that you need.
Yeah, and I think it requires some creative thinking, if I can put that into the mix. I think about hearing solutions about more outdoor learning, about taking choir outside, because then it's a little bit safer to sing if you're at a distance, those type of things. Dr. Smart, have we lost our ability to be creative about our solutions?
Well, what I think is really exciting here in the Yukon is where we're really seeing leadership in that space about being creative is from the new Yukon First Nations Education Directorate that has formed here to address the issue that too many First Nations youth in Yukon are not graduating from high school compared to other Yukoners. And what we're seeing is these types of solutions. They are saying things like, what's culturally relevant for our youth is to be out on the land. It's to be learning outside. It's to be learning from elders. It's to be participating in community, cultural activities, learning real skills like trapping, hunting, these types of things. And what I find really exciting about that as a pediatrician is I see all too often how that box that we call school does not meet the needs of all children. It's great for some kids. It is not great for all kids. And seeing that type of creativity to think outside the box, to redefine what education could be, and to look at ways of getting kids outdoors, connected back to their cultural roots, and learning that pride in their identity, I think is potentially a template for how we could move forward in other parts of our country as well.
Ray, I want to go to you on this question in terms of what you're seeing from the physical activity front in terms of the question that was just asked in our conversation from Dr. Smart.
Yeah, for sure. So coming out of a pandemic, it is very difficult to go from just staying at home and being on a computer to school and everything just happening all at once. And so I do think sports and mental health are no doubt related, but I do think that's something we should be focusing on is if we make the mental health better, then the sports will happen more. And it's kind of like it's a chain circle. So both of them need a push. And so it's very hard. And it's been like, I know that just going back to school this year for a lot of my friends has been extremely overwhelming because we had a normal summer, but we've been in lockdown just for so long, and now school's starting, sports are starting, concerts are starting up again. It's incredibly overwhelming, especially for people with social anxiety and all. And so, yeah, we do need support going in both ways.
Thank you for sharing that. I do want to read a comment as well from Lisa Marie in the chat saying, I think youth would be more inclined to participate if they began to see results from other youth who have been involved in conversations. Otherwise, I believe they may think they may be heard, but perhaps not listened to. It's a really good point, Lisa Marie, and I thank you for that as well. Naki, I want to ask you a question in terms of the conversation around physical and mental health. I realize you're coming from the private sector, so not necessarily from the health front, but what do you think about the future in terms of getting more kids access to programs and a return to normal life? Are you feeling optimistic? Because I'm hoping we can end this whole conversation on a tiny little bit of optimism.
I'm cautiously optimistic. How about that?
That's fair. Fair.
I think that what the pandemic has done has really illuminated challenges that have always been present, but I think the pandemic has made them unignorable. And that's a good thing. I think Dr. Smart was talking about the importance of defining problems. And I think the pandemic has forced us into that situation. I think we still have a lot of work to do, and hence my cautious optimism as opposed to full optimism. But I do feel like there's more attention being paid to some of these issues in ways that we hadn't seen previous to the pandemic. And I think there's a greater level of openness to doing things differently. Through the pandemic, we saw that some of the things that have always been regarded as impossible, like, oh no, we can't really do remote work. All of a sudden, we're all doing remote work. Yeah. And I think this period of time has shown us that some of the things that we thought were impossible are actually possible. And I think that the same thing can be applied to some of the challenges that we're seeing with respect to youth and physical activity and mental health. There's so much more that's possible.
I'm glad that you said, Naki, that you're cautiously optimistic. I think that's a fair statement. I was just, I think as everybody out there right now, after what we've all gone through and we think about our kids, we do want to see sort of the sunlight shining through and an end to all of this as well. Dr. Smart, a question for you that has just come in from Jaden. What can provincial governments and school do better to help youth get back their teenagehood and hopefully back to normal?
That's a great question. I think several things. I think at the government level, we need them to be prioritizing everything from public health strategies that will keep schools open. And Dr. LaFontaine commented on some of those things already, really prioritizing schools and keeping them safe. I think we really need to start thinking about schools as an essential service. I think seeing them as sort of an option is the wrong angle, and we should put the resources into keeping schools safe for children that we would put into any other essential resource like a hospital. And we've already talked about what some of those public health strategies are. So I think that's really key. For youth, I think, again, it's just keeping their voices at the table and stepping up as adults like we are today to bring their voices forward. I do think Ray's point on that earlier was really key. You know, we want youth to lead, we want to hear their voices, but we have to make sure we don't put too much burden on them. And I think we do need to keep advocating that on these issues, raising these things, and those of us in leadership positions need to keep reminding people that we can't forget about youth. We can't not treat their issues as priorities. And when we're looking at how we want to redesign the healthcare system, it needs to be done in such a way that children and youth are at the forefront.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I just want to remind people we have less than 15 minutes left. We have one or two more questions. I'm going to ask for some closing comments from each of our panelists. We do also have a video, so I'm going to throw to that video now. This is from Simi Sahota, who is a youth ambassador from Children First Canada.
Hello, my name is Simi Sahota. I am 17 years old and live in Surrey, BC, the unceded traditional territory of the Katzie, Semiahmoo, Kwantlen, and other Coast Salish people. My question for the panel is, a point that the Raising Canada report highlighted was that children as a population are most at risk for climate-related health impacts as a result of direct and indirect effects of climate change. Here in BC, we have seen many heat waves and many forest fires specifically. As this climate emergency prevails, what steps can children and youth take in order to protect themselves from some of these results of climate change?
Ray, I'm going to go to you on this one. I know this is a passion of yours.
Yeah. So the burden for the climate crisis has definitely been placed on the youth. And I know that I've met some of like my closest friends through climate action. Like it's a really strong community that I'm really grateful for. I've had so many amazing opportunities for, except I do think that we need to I think a lot of people in the climate movement right now, I know have been on really long breaks, which is great. But the reason that they are on long breaks is just because it is just so stressful. And so as much as I would recommend that people get involved with the climate crisis, the biggest thing that I can say for how youth can protect themselves is to not wear themselves out and to try as hard as they can to take care of themselves first. But if they are in a good place to, commit to these, like to meetings and interviews and all, it's a very good community. But I do think that it's not just youth that need to take action for climate change. We're not necessarily in a position of power as young people. Like, we don't have jobs and we don't have all of like the connections and all, but there are a lot of us and we have a lot of passion. So that is why we're powerful. But the main thing because I know in the past in the climate movement, something that's frustrated me is it's all like, in the past, it's been like, don't use plastic straws, don't use plastic bags, don't eat meat. And if you can do that, that's great. But being able to cut those things out of your life is 100% a privilege that not very many people have. And so the direction that we need to go in is forcing systemic change, because that's really what will change things, and not just systemic change, but intersectional systemic change. And the thing that I find so great about doing climate activism is that it's really not just climate activism. Like, sometimes we'll go weeks and we'll not even mention the climate crisis. We'll just talk about like Indigenous issues or gender equality issues, because it's all the exact same thing. Like, they're all connected, and they're all, yeah.
Well, thank you for that, Ray. I do want to go to some final comments from each of you. We have less than 4 minutes left, so maybe some just quick comments. I do want to also let you know there's a final question that came in. Are there other countries that are leading in ensuring young people are seen and heard and part of the decisions that impact their lives? So by all means, if there's anyone who's doing their final comments who can add in a country that we could look to learn about how they are better dealing with the next generation and including them in conversations, please do include that in your final comments. Naki, I'm going to come to you just for some final words and messages before we go to some thank yous and Dr. Cohen.
Well, I first want to just start by thanking Children First and for this Raising Canada report. I think this is phenomenal work, and this discussion has been such a wonderful example of the way that we need to have dialogue around these issues. Like Ray, you've blown me away so many times throughout this dialogue, and that's the kind of insight that we need. But in addition to having Ray's perspective, we've heard from young people throughout the conversation, and we know that young people were involved in the report writing. I just think this is a great example of the way that we need to be moving forward, and it goes back to something that was said earlier. Young people in our midst are not just leaders for the future, but they are leaders of today. And just a couple of additional points. I think as a private sector organization, what we've benefited from are partnerships like the one with Children First, where we can access the insights of young people. And that would be something I would encourage other private sector organizations to do as well. When we think about our role, I think the conversation we've been having about the role of positional leadership, so those of us who are in positions of leadership, I think it's probably useful for us to think of those as trustee positions that we're in, where we are responsible for a set of actions and responsible for making decisions that will be sustainable. And then my last point would be, again, just reiterating the point about normalizing the engagement of young voices. So when we're at tables asking ourselves, do we have voices of young people at this table? Are we listening to those voices? Are we returning to them to let them know how we've acted on their insights? So again, thank you for having me on the panel today, and I look forward to continuing to elevate the work of Children First.
Naki, thank you so much. I'm going to go around the panel. Dr. LaFontaine, if you can give us some final thoughts, maybe in 30, 45 seconds.
I'll echo many of the comments that have come before. I'm Indigenous, Métis with Korean Anishinaabe ancestry, as well as Pacific Islander. And a common thread when we look at our own kids is that, we really are trustees of the society we're in right now. We're making decisions that they're going to have to deal with after. In the same way that climate crisis was something that my generation inherited, it's something that my children are going to have to inherit from me. And we have to, recognize the enormous burden of our kids right now, seeing multiple crises carry out in multiple different areas of the world, and be adults and reassure them. Let them know that we are doing things to help to solve this. One of the reasons why I'm in leadership is because I want to build a better place for Ray, for my own daughters and my own sons, and for all the other kids out there. And I think our children need to hear that. They need to know that we're there for them and we're going to support them.
Thank you for that. Dr. Smart.
I'll keep it brief because I know we're running out of time. Just thank you to everyone, and especially you, Ray, for your insights and passion. That's always what fires me up and keeps me motivated for advocacy. I think Children First is showing the way forward. We need to keep talking about these issues, bringing them forward. We need to demand more of our politicians. We need to be the adults in the room. We need to remember we're designing a system for the future and those next generations of Canadians, and we can't be silent anymore on these issues. In terms of another country to look to, I'd encourage people to look at Iceland. They've done some really creative things there to engage youth and change the trajectory there for troubled youth in their country. So there's a lot of interesting ideas coming out of that country. So I'll leave you with that as an exploration.
Thank you for wrapping that question into your final comments as well. Ray, just as everybody's speaking, I'm thinking of that statement that people say often, that the kids are all right. And I think what we should be saying is that we as adults are going to make sure the kids are all right. I mean, that's what we should be saying more and more often. So Ray, before we get into some thank yous and hear from Dr. Cohen, and I'm so looking forward to that, just some final words from you.
Yes, thank you everybody so much. It's very empowering and inspiring to go on different events like this, like people who, share the same morals as me. And so thank you. It's very inspiring.
Well, thank you, Ray. And I wanted to just do some quick thank yous to our partners before we get to our final comments from Dr. Cohen. First up, wanted to thank TD for their support. Thank you so much for being part of this and being part of the report as well. Thank you to CHIO, to SureCall, the Alberta Children's Hospital Research Institute, Maple Leaf Foods, and sick kids. Thank you. This would not be possible without all of your support. Speaking of sick kids, it is my honor to introduce Dr. Ronald Cohen, President and CEO of the Hospital for Sick Children, for some final comments.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Amber, for really a terrific session. And I really echo so many of the reflections from today's panel, and really enjoyed listening to and actually learning from the insights that were shared today. Many of you probably know that our vision at Sick Kids is healthier children, a better world, and I actually truly believe, as biased as I am, that this is the best vision statement for a children's hospital, because today we face so many challenges in moving forward this vision, with more and more children and youth requiring our support every year for really a wide range of complex reasons. And families are also experiencing the disparities in access and care, and you heard about this because our system has historically been fragmented. And now the system is becoming more and more overwhelmed with pressures and has probably fewer resources available. And in turn, if you think about it, those of us who care for young people, who have been tasked with finding new ways to provide essential care and services for children and families, they're relying on us. I mean, you have heard many of the panel members talk about it is our responsibility, and we have to take that seriously. And all of these challenges have led to a steady decline, in my mind, in health and well-being of children and youth across Canada, not only putting their lives at risk, but also impacting the future of the entire country. Let's not forget, our children and our future. And while I very much agree we need to listen to the leaders and in our youth today, but all of our children are our collective future. And our pandemic has only further exacerbated the immense pressures on the pediatric healthcare system. And I think this year's Raising Canada report is incredibly important because it really helps us to truly understand the full picture of what is happening. Just at Sick Kids here, we have seen firsthand many of the same emerging issues highlighted within the report and discussed by the panel today, which is why we have advocated for children's mental health and well-being to be a key factor in public health policy decisions throughout the pandemic. So those of us who work with and for children and youth, along with their families, and even those of us who love and care for children in our personal lives, have seen how seriously the closures of school and other in-person supports, services, activities have impacted their mental, developmental, but also the physical health. And you have heard about it a little bit, but I think it's important to make sure that we know that the physical health has also been impacted. And we have also seen how this pandemic has further strained our healthcare system, which already struggles to provide timely access to things like pediatric surgery, mental health services, diagnostic imaging, and more. And all of this was really just exacerbated by this pandemic, and we have now longer wait times. Children and youth are now at a higher risk than ever before to experience significant long-term health problems, especially if critical intervention windows cannot be met. But we also must recognize the additional strains that the pandemic, in my mind, has presented in regard to the significant inequities that you have heard about, and particularly experienced by children with disabilities or mental health issues, and those from low-income families, Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities. While these are not new problems, I really love Naki's term, they are now unignorable, because the pandemic has brought these issues to the forefront in an unprecedented way. And I believe we have a responsibility, a once-in-a-lifetime responsibility, to now address these issues on a systems basis, but also on an individual basis with our patients and families. And I hope that collectively, as well as individually, we take on that responsibility. Because with all of these challenges, I think you can hear it through my passion, the urgency to support children and youth, in my mind, has never been greater. I think today we reflect on this need and strengthen our collective call to action to really improve the lives of children and youth across the entire country. And I'm so grateful for the 2021 Raising Canada report, as it provides a critical list of recommendations that are really needed right now to drive meaningful change in addressing the threats to the health and well-being of children and youth, and help mitigate the additional negative impacts from the pandemic. You have heard this requires leadership and commitment at all levels, including policymakers, clinicians, community leaders, educators, and of course parents. And it requires really a call to our federal and provincial governments to put children first, because we all benefit from helping our youngest members in our society. And by identifying and addressing some of these chronic health problems in early childhood, not when it's too late, we can really reduce the economic and social burden on families that causes poor and terrible long-term educational achievement losses, less economic success, and social deprivation. I think there's a lot we can all take away from today's event. I tremendously enjoyed it, and I think we should think about how we can incorporate some of this into our own lives as advocates for children and youth. I think we all have a role to play in providing young people with the opportunities they deserve, and I urge really all of you to share the messages from today's event. Lastly, I just want to thank Sarah and the Children's First Canada organization for your continued efforts to raise awareness about these issues. More than ever, let's make sure that everyone understands that every day matters in the life of a child. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cohen, for those final comments. And thank you, everyone who's joined us today. A huge thank you to all of the partners and the panelists who've been part of this event. Thank you to all of the attendees for taking the time out of your day to join us for this virtual event. And it's been a pleasure throughout this hour and a half to be your host for Raising Canada 2021. Thanks so much.